Well, what I'm going to present is coming out of this book that's been so widely discussed, Reclaiming the Prophet, An Honest Defense of Ellen White's Gift. I wrote a chapter that was kind of an experiment in what might be called counter-factual history, or to just use plain English, what if history. Historians often do think about what did not happen or why it didn't happen. And I can think of many examples in my own area. Uh, Historians have spent a lot of time thinking, how would Abraham Lincoln have handled Reconstruction differently from Andrew Johnson? Or as we're teaching about the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, students wonder, well, why didn't this happen sooner? Why did the civil rights movement succeed when it did? And there are plenty of other questions like that. I have a kind of a weakness. I like historical fiction. And I read quite a bit of historical fiction. And sometimes historical fiction goes a long way in this counterfactual or what if history. For example, a few years ago, Robert Harris wrote a book called Fatherland. The book is set in an imaginary time. It's 1964. The Second World War has come to a surprising end in that Hitler won, the United States remained neutral, and the main character is a judicial officer in Nazi Germany who is investigating the mysterious deaths of a number of senior Nazi leaders. Now, what in the world does that have to do with history? Well, what turns out, that many of you may have read the book, is that in this scenario where Hitler has won, it's still very important to deny the Holocaust. And it turns out that the people being killed are people who were at the Wannsee meeting in January of 1942 who planned the final solution. And now we want to destroy all evidence of that, even though it's succeeded. Now, this book to me suggests some really very interesting things. One of the most interesting, and this involves real history, not imaginary history, is how important it was to Hitler's regime to deny or to keep silent about what they were doing. They didn't go forward and say, oh, yes, we are carrying out a plan to exterminate the Jews, and we're justified in doing so. They had to hide the evidence. Another book along these lines, and I don't know if this is going to put us off the track here as we think about what if history. One of the most interesting ones I ever read was by a man named Harry Turtledove. And he wrote a description, a book called The Guns of the South. In this book, it's January 1864. Things look pretty bad for the Confederacy. Lee's troops are in winter quarters, and some men show up, some mysterious men dressed in odd ways with knowledge of some things that nobody else knows. For example, they understand that Robert E. Lee's heart trouble could be helped by some nitroglycerin pills. They hadn't heard of anything like that. And then these people produce a weapon that they want to give to the Confederacy. They say, now this is a weapon where if you pull the trigger, it will shoot 30 times. And they go out and demonstrate. It's just an incredible weapon compared to the muzzle-loading muskets that they have. And they talk that over, and the Confederate officers say, what do you call this weapon? And these strange men dressed in strange ways say, well, we call it an AK-47. Well, what happens in this story is it turns out these are time travelers. These are men from white South Africa who want to change the course of history. And they have in their baggage the American heritage picture history of the Civil War, which Lee discovers, published in 1960, and he finds out what was going to happen. Well, this whole thing was not a frivolous exercise. It was not written by a person who wanted the South to win. He's focusing, and oddly enough, the whole book is filled with real characters. Almost everybody in the book is someone who existed in history. He's trying to focus on some of the basic facts about the Civil War. And one of the basic facts that he points out in this incredible, remarkable way is even if the South had won, they still would have a fundamental problem with the survival of slavery and the defense of slavery in the world. And in fact, what happens after the Southern victory, after Abraham Lincoln retires in disgrace to Illinois, and after 180,000 Black troops go into a guerrilla war mode, is the South has to decide, okay, what do we do about slavery? And there's a big conflict between Robert E. Lee and Nathan Bedford Forrest. And it really boils down to, is this something that is a temporary measure, a necessary evil for a time, or is it something that's permanently good? And that book ends up making us think about some things we wouldn't have thought about. So I'm suggesting that counterfactual history isn't a frivolous exercise. And as we prepared this book that was committed to the idea of being accurate about Ellen White, I thought, well, let's try that. Let's try a counterfactual exercise, thinking about what we would have if Ellen White were not present, or if she died earlier than we thought she did. All right, now all of this is not typical for Adventist history or Ellen White studies. Imagine something. What if? What could have happened? In my essay, and some of you have read it, in my essay, I have 5 different scenarios. The first scenario is this. Ellen White died in 1884, not 1915. What difference, I asked, would this pseudo-fact make in Adventist history? And you can see what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get around some rather thoroughly fought over grounds, some issues that have been talked up and down, and simply say, all right, what did she contribute? I'm not talking about the miraculous or the unusual or the uncanny. I'm saying, all right, let's imagine Adventist history without her. So here's how the history might have been written. I've written it up this way. Worn out by unrelenting work and deep sorrow over the death in 1881 of James, her energetic and I might say prickly husband, Ellen White died 3 years later. Church leaders mourned her death, remembering the role she played in transforming the Adventist church from a group of scattered saints, including a few fanatics, with a group with a clear set of doctrines and a mission to the world. They knew in 1884 the church's new commitment to healthful living, education, missions was closely tied to what Ellen White had done in her travel and preaching. And they all resolved we're going to be faithful to what she's done. We don't want to have some kind of mission drift. We don't want to forget our basic commitments. And they remember in a lot of areas, they remember ways that she contributed. Well, a new teaching, as you know, roils Adventism about the time of this pseudo-death. Younger leaders, including A.T. Jones and E.J. Wagner, who are far away from the denominational headquarters in Battle Creek, provoke a debate about what the Apostle Paul is discussing in the epistle to the Galatians. And you remember the very familiar language. They would, of course, be reading it in the King James. Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law. Well, what law is that? The law is a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. We are no longer under a schoolmaster. Adventists had traditionally insisted that Paul was talking about the ceremonial law, not the unchanging moral law of the Ten Commandments. And these young reformers say, no, that's wrong. It includes all law. It's both moral law and ceremonial law. And we need to recognize that, or we'll drift into legalism. Well, led by Uriah Smith and G.I. Butler, the denomination leaders handled this challenge very skillfully. They said, you've got to have an orderly response. We can't just have a couple people somewhere coming up with a new doctrine. We need to have the brethren of experience look at this. It's irresponsible to simply share radical ideas without any attempt at a consensus building. And more than that, we have met this doctrine before. According to Butler and Smith, years earlier in the 1850s, Joseph H. Wagner, the father of E.J. Wagner, had challenged the idea that Paul was only talking about ceremonial law. But Ellen White had a vision on the subject, and she rejected the older Wagner's teaching in 1856. And if that's not enough evidence, the traditionalist argued, please read Ellen White's latest book, Sketches from the Life of Paul. In her discussion of the book of Galatians, there's no hint that Adventists should change their understanding of the law. To the end of her life, they would say, she taught that the law from which Christ freed us was that the law that they were no longer under was the Mosaic law, the temple ceremonies, not the moral law. Well, a tract war follows, with Butler publishing a tract called The Law in Galatians in 1886, the younger Wagner responding with the gospel in the book of Galatians 2 years later, and they both claimed to be defending Ellen White. Finally, after repeated and patient explanations at camp meetings and church publications, the church leaders felt compelled to act, and at the General Conference of 1888, the proponents of the new view were officially rebuked and then defrocked, stripped of their ministerial credentials. Of course, righteousness by faith is important, declared the church leaders, but we've always understood that. We must reaffirm the old landmarks, which is what the late Sister White would have wanted us to do. Now at this point, you're probably saying, okay, wait, remind us what really did happen? And of course, you know that what really did happen, the leader who did not die in 1884 made quite a difference. The living Ellen White was not as easy to control as an honored dead one. She was a woman with a mind of her own. She was not always predictable. And her conservative defenders were stunned by her actions in response to a serious doctrinal challenge. And I think we can share the shock. Instead of having their ministerial credentials canceled, the young reformers were endorsed by the aging prophet. What might have happened, what happened in my imaginary scenario, did not happen at all. In this crisis about how we should read Galatians, Ellen White did not allow her earlier statements to close off discussion. She wanted the participants in this debate to go back to the biblical text. She wouldn't use something she'd said years earlier as a trump card, if we can use card-playing metaphors here. She supported, in short, the reformers, the progressives against the old guard, but she also criticized both sides. Again and again, she called for charity and toleration, and she didn't think that anybody, even people who might be wrong, had a right to be contemptuous or furious at the people who differed with them. In short, even though Ellen White was sure that she was being led by God, she changed her mind. And we might not notice that if we hadn't first spelled out the imaginary scenario. She changed her mind. In response to the debate about how to read Galatians, she adjusted her priorities. And in other words, the compelling message of 1888 or the 1880s was different from the key issue of the 1840s. And in fact, looking back, she would find some things that were imperfect or wrong about the 1840s. At each point of this discussion, the living prophet was determined to connect theology to practical religion. The law as a schoolmaster leading us to Christ had to be more than a metaphor or a technical argument. She was asking all parts, all sides of this debate to think about, how does this change how I live? So that's one example of what if thinking. Imagine Ellen White had died in 1884, and with her history, with the things she said before, it would be quite easy to imagine the editor of the Review and the president of the General Conference using Ellen White to silence these people calling for change. Her being alive made that difficult. Now, I have 4 other examples that I thought of Ellen White being alive and therefore able to challenge the way her work is used. I would say that you could argue that a lot of Adventists in those days and maybe today want Ellen White to stop living at some convenient point. In this one, we had 1884. You could make it 1904. I'm going to talk about this later. You could make it early. They don't give her the ability to say, but that's not what I meant at all, or it looks different now, or I've had more light on the subject. In short, what I'm saying is, whether it was convenient or not, she kept living right up until her last days at Elmshaven. Let me give you 2 or 3 other examples. First of all, Ellen White was very clear in her teaching on early childhood education, something we still deal with. From at least the 1870s, she'd been saying, do not send your little ones away to school too early. And this counsel she gave long before the Adventist educational system was up and running. In 1902, the Adventist community around the St. Helena Hospital opens a church school. And what follows is really interesting, not to say deliciously ironic. When they opened the school, they're determined to follow Ellen White's counsel, and she lives in the neighborhood. So they make no provision for students who are 8 years old or younger. After a year or two, in 1904, Ellen White says, we ought to do something for these younger students, the students who are 7 and 8 and 9 years old. As a practical matter, some of these kids are just running wild, and we need to have some education for them. So they have a school board meeting, and at the school board meeting, with Mrs. White present, a bunch of people say, oh no, we can't do that. Sister White says, and she's sitting there. Well, in that meeting, she says, wait a minute, remember the context. Wonderful word. She'd been warning against too early school attendance when there was no Adventist school system. And secondly, this is an ideal. Maybe some parents can't live up to it. Here's what she said to this school board. And I would argue that it's hard to imagine better instructions for somebody trying to use her writings. She said, in some exasperation, God wants us all to have common sense. Without in any way retreating from her description of what was ideal, she said, circumstances alter conditions. Circumstances alter the relation of things. Here we have a group of people who say they believe in present truth, who are part of a culture that celebrates progress, but they didn't expect their prophet to change. And yet she does. as long as she's there, as long as she can comment on application. There are quite a few other examples we could give in the book, Reclaiming the Prophet. Don McAdams has written a chapter on turning points, including turning points that don't turn. And he gives quite a few examples of places where Ellen White is brought to remind her followers that her words are not divinely chosen. Well, she's not supposed to change, but she does change. Let me give you three other examples. Another example involves great controversy. This book that is so popular and has been sent out in such unprecedented numbers in recent years. She had a great controversy vision, as they described it, in 1858. She first wrote a couple hundred pages about that, and that eventually becomes, by 1916, with the final and posthumous volume of Conflict of the Ages series, that becomes 3,500 pages. Now, scholars have paid a great deal of attention to her sources, noting her reliance on both standard recreations of biblical stories and the Protestant historians of her time. And she recycles a great deal. That's, I guess, a safe way to put it. She recycles a great deal of their words and structure and some of their mistakes. It hasn't been commented on very much how Ellen White's message changed in translation. Not only do we have these changes in the English edition, but as we look at Great Controversy as it's published in international editions, particularly in the Spanish world, there's quite a bit that is changed. Late in her life, she approved adjusting her Reformation history for Spanish readers by adding a chapter, not written by her, on Protestant stirrings in Spanish history. The language of the book, with her approval, was changed to moderate what her son Willie White called an anti-Catholic spirit. Prompted by concerned leaders in Europe, the prophet's son and counselor agreed in 1913, quote, that we should modify with the author's consent several of those passages which are most objectionable to our Roman Catholic critics. In the Spanish edition that is right now sold in Catholic countries, some of the most militant language has been carefully toned down. And that probably is worth a further study, exactly how the language is toned down. For Ellen White and her advisors, this course of action was just common sense. As she wrote late in life, we should not go out of our way to make hard thrusts at the Catholics. Among the Catholics, there are many who are most conscientious Christians and who walk in all the light that shines upon them, and God will work on their behalf. In addition to the translation into Spanish, we could mention some other things. The White Estate, which is the sort of official custodian of her writings, has followed a pragmatic policy, and they voted this in 1949. Wow, a long time ago. We leave the matter of the use of terms designating the Catholic Church to the individual fields, they voted. In those places where it is deemed that the present terminology of the Great Controversy would be offensive, the trustees are agreed to the substitution of terms which do not in any way change the meaning. Now, at this point, you might say, wait a minute, how do you change the words without changing the meaning? At the very least, you're trying to improve the expression. So they recommended the original wording be retained where it's not offensive. I would say very few Adventists are aware that Great Controversy reads somewhat differently in Spanish or German, but as the prophet told the school board, circumstances alter conditions. Another episode, I guess, if you're counting, this is the third one, is the battle that occurred in the early 20th century about Daniel 8:13. Now, I admit this is pretty obscure stuff. We spend a lot of time talking about Daniel 8:14. Daniel 8:13 says, how long shall the vision How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? And the famous answer in the next verse is under 2,300 days. Now, the word sacrifice is supplied. The King James Version is in italics. It's not, it's implied, I guess you could say, with the daily. Early on, even before the name Seventh-day Adventist was adopted, the Millerite position was that the daily of Daniel 8:13 referred to the activities of pagan Rome. By the early 20th century, certain denominational leaders were saying, no, they really need a new understanding. The daily refers to a false view of Christ's mediation in the heavenly sanctuary. And that's the work, they say, of papal Rome. Now, I don't know if your eyes are glazing over at this moment, whether Daniel 8:13 is talking about pagan Rome or papal Rome. Here's the interesting part to me. People who defended the old view said, we are defending Ellen White. This interpretation can't change because she already had an interpretation. In early writings, she wrote, I saw in relation to the daily that the word sacrifice was applied by man's wisdom, and the Lord gave the correct interpretation to those who gave the judgment hour cry in 1844. As one of the people involved in this controversy put it, the new view of the daily squarely contradicts the spirit of the prophecy. Now, once again, Ellen White's still alive, and she does not allow her work to end the discussion. In several statements she made around 1910, very near the end of her life, she asked that her writings not be used as a leading argument to settle questions over which there's now so much controversy, saying, I do not have any instruction from the Lord on this subject, and I didn't understand what I wrote earlier as resolving this question. In effect, as the Adventist scholar Bert Holoviak wrote years ago, she was telling both sides of the debate that in her early writing statement, she was not using the term daily in a technical or theological sense, simply in a broader setting. So far, the proponents of the new view could say, oh, fine, okay, now she's on our side. But she didn't do that. She said this is a minor matter, and she asked both sides to tone it down, to be silent. As one of the young reformers said at the time, later he was General Conference president, I'm very glad she did not endorse the new opinion, for that is not what was needed. In words that might be applied to many later debates, he added, we do not want any infallible declaration as to our own views about it, for we shall study more and learn more. Willie White summarized this whole debate in a way that has always hit me pretty hard. He told a colleague there are two questions about this argument about who was right in Daniel 8:13. The first is, how do we deal with one another when there's a difference of opinion? We still have that one. How do we deal with one another when there's a difference of opinion? Second, how should we deal with Mother's writings in an effort to settle doctrinal questions? And in the end, his mother had very definite insights. She opposed all attempts to make her writings, rather than the Bible, the final arbiter of theological controversy, although she was quite clear in a number of other places about what Adventist priorities ought to be. She also advised her most vehement supporters to make some distinction between major and minor, to avoid dogmatism, to know when to keep silent. Again, quoting her earlier statements, circumstances changed the relationship. Now, her leadership did not always simply say, let's all get along, let's be harmonious. Some of her statements pushed in a very definite direction. One of my favorite is her statements in Desire of Ages about the divinity of Christ. Her statements are clearly Trinitarian, in distinct contrast to the teachings of many Adventist pioneers, including her husband. The most powerful statement comes in Desire of Ages: in Christ is life, original, unborrowed, underived. The divinity of Christ is a believer's assurance of eternal life. Now, at least one of her admirers couldn't believe she said that, had to go to Elmshaven and look in the files and make sure this is what she actually wrote. The intriguing thing for me is that she's borrowing those words. She takes a book, which we have here at PUC in the Walterette Library, where we've recreated her personal library, from a book called Sabbath Evening Readings by a Scottish clergyman named John Cumming, published in 1855. And he writes, this is page 6 of his book, speaking of the Gospel of John. John at once begins by asserting the deity of Christ as God and Lord of all. And he states, in him was life. That is original, unborrowed, and underived. Now, there are several different ways we can act or respond to this. We've had a lot of debate about how Ellen White uses other people's words. It probably would bother some people that her originality doesn't preclude taking these words from somebody else. But it is interesting that her borrowing is used for what we may call an original enterprise. She's leading the denomination from an incomplete understanding of Jesus and the Trinity to an insight firmly rooted in the history of Christianity. I don't think that the dwindling group of anti-Trinitarians in the Adventist Church can draw much comfort from the fact that that phrase is a borrowed phrase. I think a lot of our problem with understanding Ellen White, and this is one of the purposes of this counterfactual history, is we start by simply saying, here's some principles of interpretation, and we therefore deduce that the following must have happened. I think if we begin with actually how she behaved, events, actions, and then inductively try to find a pattern, we might come up with a different understanding. And I think, in fact, this inductive approach might be closer to her reaction to people misusing her writings. Well, I could mention one other one that happens long after her death. I'll skip over this one quickly. It is the decision in 2014 to close the Review and Herald. In this case, Ellen White has very clear statements that the Review and Herald publishing house should not be combined with Pacific Press. Now, the people who are tasked with making this decision have to come to terms with their historical context and have to admit that publishing as a business is completely different in 2014 from what it was in the 1890s. Applying her counsel meant a lot of interpretation. Church leaders didn't use this occasion to explain that, but they did in the end close the Review and Herald. I would argue that what appeared to be disobedience to her counsel could be consistent with the spirit of the counsel, just as faithful Adventists, believers in the work of Ellen White, might appropriately invite 7-year-olds to attend school, or change the terminology in great controversy, or expand our understanding of the law, or reinterpret an ancient prophecy. That was perhaps a missed opportunity. Now, I would say, here's the lesson I see from all of this counterfactual history. Applying Ellen White's counsel means treating her words as living insights, not frozen pronouncements. It won't do to simply put a bumper sticker on our car and say, Mrs. White said it, I believe it. God wants us to have common sense. She might reply to that. Now, the exercise of pretending Ellen White died in 1884 has taught us a certain amount. We learned that it's unwise to deduce from general principles what she must have done. Time and again, she surprised her contemporaries and us by rejecting plausible but inaccurate use of her messages or interpretations that ignore the role of change in her ministry. At unexpected moments, the prophet rebuked favored proteges or tolerated inconvenient new light. I would urge us to, as we read Ellen White today, pretend that she's alive. Believing in her often requires that we follow her lead in replacing an outmoded view with a clearer one. As Seventh-day Adventists attempt to apply the providential counsel of the past on subjects ranging from health and education to last things and holy living, we need to exercise our historical imagination and create continuing moments of conversation with Ellen White. That's the way I think to reclaim the prophet. All right, that's my exercise in counterfactual history. What do we learn from that? And you may want to think about where this fits in the larger book, Reclaiming the Prophet. That book is temporarily unavailable, but well, it's actually available all over the place. There are some book and Bible houses still selling a few copies of it. And in addition, there are electronic versions all over the place. Well, here's some questions I've proposed, and see if you want to run with any of them. I offered this what if history in defense of Ellen White. Now, be honest, has it improved your opinion of Ellen White to see a person who appeals to common sense, changes, and refuses to allow her counsel to prematurely end a debate? Or does this seem like special pleading? Question 2 is related. How would this interpretation be received in Adventist churches outside of, a few college towns? Would it be seen as constructive? And this is, of course, related to the larger question. I thought the book, Reclaiming the Prophet, was constructive, but some people didn't think so. My spies tell me that the former president of the General Conference festooned our book with yellow stick-it notes and was quite unhappy about it. Number 3, your defense of Ellen White is simply too late for most Adventists, most American Adventists under 40, says Brother B. Is he right? We won't identify Brother B. 4, more counterfactual history. How would your own life be different if you had not encountered Ellen White? And 5, help me to think of potential moments of continuing conversation with Ellen White. How can we appropriately apply her ideas on education, end times, or spirituality today? One other question occurred to me since I sent these questions to Lauren is, why did I have my counterfactual history involve the older, mature Ellen White? Ellen White after she stopped having visions. I had to think about that. What if we'd chosen to think about Ellen White dying in 1860 or 1861, before she has the health reform vision, before she has some of her counsel on education? Is it more appropriate? And as I think about the book, Reclaiming the Prophet, much of what's in that book deals with the mature and independent Ellen White rather than Ellen White in the earlier part of her life. Well, there's some questions. And I don't know where you want to go. I'm happy to talk about the book as a whole. I don't want to say too much about the so-called banning of the book. I do have a prophecy I'm willing to make if someone wants that. I've often been proved to be a false prophet in the past, so I'm not I don't expect to be treated as too authoritative there.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. Really have appreciated the care you've taken to walk us through this counterfactual approach to Ellen White. And one of the things that I've recognized is the more I learn about her as a person, independently of how she's traditionally taught, the more I think I would get along with her a lot better if I can separate her from the way that she's taught by the church, which I think presents an interesting contrast, because a lot of the leadership seems stuck in extracting her most conservative pronouncements, even ones that she herself have said no, put it into context and change. So I don't know what we do with that. It seems like there's a quote you made that I wrote down. We treat her words as frozen pronouncements as opposed to living insights. I don't know if there is any hope for us to move beyond that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think the very first thing you need to do is be candid. We've sort of had the idea that if we put the best face on things, if we don't talk in front of the children, as my parents used to say, that we'll be better off. And I don't think that's true. I think the kinds of arguments and debates and revelations we've had over the last 50 years in North America will be repeated around the world. And it doesn't make sense to repeat the mistakes of the response there. I think this book and the conference that led up to it, we're all committed to the idea, let's grant that the contextualizing that's been done is basically accurate. Now what do we do? I gather there's some people in the church who are not willing to do that. They're not willing to say, oh yeah, the contextualizing is correct or mostly correct, you know. I see some interesting hands here. The first one I see is Lester Kaiser, who was one of my first students when I was 21 years old.
Awesome. Lester, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Yeah, Dr. Anderson, 60 years ago. It's so good to see your voice. What a lot of people don't, I'm calling, by the way, from La Paz, Mexico. What a lot of people don't really know about you is that you started your work and your leadership to Adventism in the jungles of Borneo.
That's right,
and student missionary. Before I go to my question, one of the things that helped define me, you were already very provocative back then. You remember, or maybe you don't remember, that we had an American missionary who his form of preaching was to come into the pulpit with big Ellen G. White books. These were, I don't know, the testimonies. He was proud of them. He'd carry 6 or 7, and he would just read from them for preaching. And then I can remember the day when you were invited to preach, and all you did was come up with a Bible and you talked to us. I thought that was very profound coming from a very home. And I really appreciate your words about, helping us understand the living, evolving Ellen G. White, and you praising her for her willingness to change her mind and contradict her earlier views and reject inflexible views. But, it brings a deeper theological dilemma that I've been struggling with for, like many of you, for the last 60 years. If she could revise, adapt, and even contradict herself, then on what unshakable basis do we still call her the prophet rather than a simple spiritual wise leader for the day? But to really get to the core of my question, the tension of this argument is that if Ellen White's writings require such flexible, evolving interpretation based on common sense, then what exactly gives her prophetic authority enduring value beyond historical influence? Thank you so for your time, and let's go to Borneo soon.
Yeah, and of course, beyond historical influence covers a huge amount. That historical influence would be very, very significant. I don't know, Lester, would you be okay with saying Ellen White has an influence on us that is central in much the way that John Wesley has an influence on Methodists? Would that be
Yeah,
too watered down?
no, I think that's leading us in the right direction
Yeah,
because as long as we have Adventism, she will always be with us. And
yeah.
the detractors, whatever they may try to do, we aren't here just because of her. There are other influences that brought us here. But to try and reconcile, I think you are understanding the deep tension here that I'm going through and on where it really has a lot to do with the future of the Adventist church, although I'm not worried about that. God's going to lead wherever he desires us to. But it's a real dilemma for me and how I can sort of work through that. But you're helping us, I think, try to get that and opening our minds to think in a more mature way.
I need to come down and visit you in that beautiful Mexican port. Anyway,
All right.
oh, I see.
Thank you so much, Lester. Lauren, you are next in line to join the conversation. While you're unmuting, there are several of you who your names are just showing up as iPhone. So we're asking that you put your real names so that we can identify
I see.
everyone who is online. So
I see
Lauren,
Brian.
please go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lauren is next in line.
Yeah, it does help if you use your real names. I appreciate that too. It also helps us feel a little more secure that you're participants and not somebody who's just coming on. Uh, yeah, no, I love what's going on here, and I fall into the category of lifelong multi-generation Seventh-day Adventists, Dr. Anderson, who owe a great deal to the Seventh Adventist Church and to Ellen White. For example, I grew up in a blue collar working family with parents who didn't have advanced education, but I got to do that because of the Adventist education ethos that is at least partially um, attributable to Ellen White. So I'm deeply grateful for all of that. So I just want to give that as a prelude. Uh, but here's my question. What does this do to our understanding of what it means to be inspired? What happens to the doctrine of inspiration? This notion that somebody, when we say they're inspired, get magic authority, and suddenly they're everything they say is no longer able to be discussed or evaluated or analyzed in any way. And I say this because I'm not somebody who ever really preached from Ellen White or from the Spirit of Prophecy. I preach from the Bible, but I used the Bible in that way. Like it was magic. It wasn't, what was your phrase, living insights that you can pretend they're still alive. No, we didn't take it that way. We microanalyzed the passages of the Bible, and Paul uses this word here, and then he uses it over here. And so in the context of the Greek language of the time and the Koine Greek and everything, I mean, we looked at it as though it were extremely perfect, intended to be perfect. What's it do to the whole idea of inspiration? That's my question.
Well, I think we need to recognize that Ellen White may not be able to explain everything that happened to her to us. I'm struck by looking at the various points of view on Ellen White. And I would say that the defenders of Ellen White, some of the harshest critics of Ellen White, maybe Ellen White herself, all had a view of what a true prophet was that may be inadequate. It may not be accurate. Just one small thing. I don't see, as I study Ellen White's work, that the predictive element is central. You know, you look at the Ellen White on the Civil War. She doesn't say, oh, I've been talking to this angel and there's something big going to happen in this little town called Gettysburg. She talks about what's your duty. Well, how should we react? What does God expect from us? I think that we might start by simply recognizing that a prophet is a certain kind of leader, not necessarily primarily a predictor. That'd be one thing. The other thing is I still want to get back to this point. Let's say for purposes of learning or heuristic purposes, she's inspired. Now let's look at the record. What does that mean? How does that work? Rather than starting out with some assumptions that it must work this way.
And yet that kind of thinking, I will just say, is somewhat fatal to the fundamentalisms that shaped who Adventists were.
Well, I a couple of weeks ago spent the Sabbath arguing we need to be more careful how we use the word fundamentalism. I think there's a certain sense in which all of the people in this debate, as we look at the early 20th century, are fundamentalists. There's another sense in which people like A.G. Daniels clearly rejects verbal inspiration, which would make him, at least in that respect, not a fundamentalist.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm anxious to hear from Brian Strayer. I see his hand there, and I think of Brian Strayer as the biographer of J.N. Loughborough. And Loughborough is the one who we go to for many of these miraculous stories, holding up the big Bible, Ellen White not breathing, and so on. And I do wonder why back to your question, do we start with that kind of stuff? If you're trying to persuade a non-Adventist to accept the leadership of Ellen White, would you start with, well, there were some witnesses who said she didn't breathe, or somebody tried to hold up a big Bible? I don't know. Loughborough is not a totally reliable guy, is he, Brian?
No, he is definitely not totally reliable. And when it came, as you know, when it came to the controversy over the daily, he refused to be silent. I mean, he was very strongly pro Ellen White, but on that issue, he just dug in his heels and would not be silent. My question to you, though, is an easy one to answer, I hope. Is there any chance that this book that's been banned might be republished under a non-Adventist publisher, as, for example, Ron Numbers did with his Ellen White Prophetess of Health? Is there any remote possibility?
No, I think that's a certainty. If the Pacific Press does not resume sales of it, it will be published somewhere else. And we live in a pretty strange time. I think it's very hard to ban a book, and I keep running into these electronic versions that are circulating. I guess someone put something on Internet Archive, which has now disappeared, but there are plenty of them out there. I don't believe, as a practical matter, that it's possible over the long term to take a book by, with George Knight and people like that and say, oh, no, you can't read it. The thing I don't understand is George Knight has said many of these things before. Take this book, Ellen White's Afterlife. And you turn around the back, it says prophet or plagiarist. Well, some people seem to be allergic to that word, but here's an official publisher that has it in there. I'm not sure that, well, I guess I don't understand why Reclaiming the Prophet has been under a cloud as far as some church leaders are concerned. And this book is just fine. Something doesn't add up. So I would say here's my prophecy. I've just said prophecy is predictive elements, not that important, but I'll make a prophecy, and that is to quote, to paraphrase a certain World War II hero, "We shall return." I think it's likely that Reclaiming the Prophet will be available again in a few months. Typically what happens in the church is you have committees and you talk about it and you look into it and you say, is this a problem? The people I'm running into, pretty traditional church leaders are saying, oh, this is a good book. And the notion that this is somehow a problem, I don't understand that. I told the head of the White Estate that we had a friendly fire incident here. We're defending Ellen White. We're being pictured as attacking her.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that question. Next, we have Emmanuel. Please go ahead and join the conversation.
Yes, thank you. I really enjoy the presentation. And my question is, what is the place of Ellen White? What is the place of biblical hermeneutic and exegesis in Adventist theology?
Well, I would certainly hope that our theology is based on the Bible. I was very pleased with the decision by the Andrews University Study Bible to not include Ellen White comments. I think that was a mistake of the original Bible commentary because it makes it look like we're treating Ellen White as equal to the Bible. So again, looking at the 1919 Bible Conference, A.G. Daniels is just crystal clear that it's wrong, it's unacceptable to have an Adventist teaching that is based on Ellen White and not the Bible.
I came from Guadeloupe, French West Indies. Everything in the church, what did Ellen White say? What did Ellen White say? You don't see what Paul say, what Matthew say, what Luke say. What did Ellen White say? So we advertise sola scriptura, but in reality, sola scriptura plus Ellen White writing. If I take a position opposite to Ellen White position on a subject, I am the devil father right there.
Well, I think that's not the way it is in the United States now. But that's interesting that there are places where that is the case. I would think in general, we do not cite Ellen White the way we did when I was a college student. And I think a large part of it is we know much more about the history of it. There's a wonderful book out there that I'm waiting for someone to rediscover called The Literary Beauty of Ellen White's Writings, where an English scholar goes through and talks about how wonderful her choice of words is, how wonderful and appropriate her metaphors are, and so on. It's a little hard to see that given what we now know about the way some of her books are produced.
All right, thank you so much for that question, Emmanuel, and Dr. Anderson. And I'm seeing Lauren saying in the chat that in flyover country, that approach to Ellen White is still taken, and all across the Caribbean, that is my experience as well. So there is still sorts of the church where it is Ellen White first. But yeah, Dana, please go ahead, join the conversation.
Hi. So it makes me laugh when people are talking about banning a book because I lived under Ceausescu and he couldn't even ban a book. So it's funny, it's funny. But unfortunately, I didn't get your book, so I couldn't read it. So thank you so much for this presentation. And it made me reflect on my life in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. As I said, I grew up in a traditional Adventist environment where people almost worshipped Ellen White. It was, I'm glad I'm talking after Emmanuel because that was my experience. People were saying that Ellen White is not equal to the Bible, yet in the daily practice, they were reading and quoting Ellen White more than the Bible. It was the ultimate place where you would go when you had to make a decision, and at that time, I even won a local contest from the Great Controversy. They would ask us questions. So it's not like I always had this aversion over Ellen White, or that I have it now. But I'm trying to explain how my relationship with her grew and developed. Because it was very difficult. I realized soon enough in my life, it was very difficult to sell Ellen White to outsiders, people outside of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. How do we explain her place? How do we explain who she is? Oh, she's a prophet, but she's not in the Bible, and she's kind of contemporary. And then I had to ask uncomfortable questions of myself, like, do we supposed to love our neighbors, or do we supposed to hate the Catholics, or at least the Pope? And so on. So for a quite long time, I set Ellen White aside with a big, big question mark beside her. But I'm very, very grateful for people like you, because I think you open the door for a place where we find a balance, where we include Ellen White in the Adventist family, we recognize her role, and also we recognize her humanity. So I'm deeply, deeply grateful as a Seventh-day Adventist that is still in church for that, because I have friends who left the church because of Ellen White.
Yeah.
So my final question would be, it looks like your book would make peace, or at least would help people like me make peace with Ellen White. What can we do with people from other countries? What can we do for the people that left the church because of Ellen White?
Well, that's
Do
a
you
great
think-
question.
Yeah, do you think there is any hope for that?
I think we've got to recognize that the contextualizers who came along and said, wait a minute, what you're saying about Ellen White is not correct, they will be echoed throughout the world. If we say raw numbers created a crisis in the Adventist church by showing how we were saying things about the health methods that were not accurate, or if we say Walter Ray demonstrated that Ellen White had borrowings in her writing that were far greater than anyone realized, I would say we need to recognize in the world of 2025 that it's inevitable that there will be in the near future a West Indian Ron Numbers, a Korean Walter Ray, a Nigerian Jonathan Butler, who will come along and say, wait a minute, the story you're telling is not accurate. You need to pay close attention. And I would hope that we would do a better job of the second time around answering those questions.
Have you pursued translating the book in other languages? I think we need this book in Europe.
I haven't answered this letter yet, but I got a letter from a man a few weeks ago, a couple months ago, who wanted to translate it into Spanish and Portuguese. Now, Portuguese takes on a new significance to me in the light of the recent events in the GC. But anyway, no, that would make sense. It would make sense to translate it. It is interesting to see, to take another example, George Knight's work has been translated and sold in Adventist book centers in many places. But then every so often, someone come along and say, no, you can't do that. That's terrible stuff. And there'll be an attempt to suppress it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And thank you to Dana for your question. Sorry, Richard Reiner, you are next in line. Please go ahead and join the conversation.
Hey, Eric, good to see you again.
Hey, how are you?
I just read, I'm kind of a wannabe history buff. I just read Gail Valentine's book on Prescott and just finished Ben MacArthur's book on A.J. Daniels.
Yeah.
And it was interesting how many fights the brethren had back then. But my question is, in your what if scenario, Eric, what if Ellen White hadn't been here, would we have had Loma Linda? Would we have had the higher education system? I mean, she pushed these guys where they didn't want to go, from my perspective. So in your what if scenario, we are a lot better off for what her being around and getting some of these institutions established than maybe otherwise would have never happened. Agreed? Or
Yeah, I think she is a marvelous institution builder, and many of us could say, oh, this part of my life is different. The education that's available, the health system that's available, the mission system that's available, all those things we owe to some degree to Ellen White. And I think it's helpful to recognize that rather than, I mean, I would start with the kind of observation you just made rather than say, well, there were some witnesses who said she didn't breathe during vision.
yeah.
You
Or would
know?
we even have the health system we have today if she hadn't encouraged the establishment of some of the early sanitariums? Anyway.
Well, and numbers makes it very clear that she's part of a health reform tradition, that her words are not unique and they're not infallible, but she does create something that lasts a lot longer than any of the other health reformers at the time.
Yep.
That's worth remembering.
All right, thank you so much, Richard, for that question. Next, we have Robert Ramsey. Robert, please go ahead, unmute and join the conversation.
Thank you for the presentation. It made me think of, I've read Ellen White pretty well all my life, and I get the impression that she was a very practical person. That she did write things that people would take as hard and fast rules, but she would bend those rules in certain situations. Going back to Emmanuel's talk, I remember Dr. Timothy Jennings mentioning that he knew somebody who'd been doing research at the White Center, and he couldn't understand how anybody got any work done because as soon as the phones opened, they were just jammed with people wanting to know what Ellen White said about this, that, or the other thing. But my more pointed comment is when you were talking about the school board and how she changed her mind about educating the younger children. I get the impression that she was very critical of science or scientists in her day. And I wonder what she would be saying these days, particularly about sexual orientation, that it's not a choice, that it's something that is inborn. Do you think she would be taking science into account, or would she still be very critical of any research being done by worldly scientists?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I really don't know the answer to that. I would think that well, you almost have to tie it to the way we deal with ideas about sexuality from the Bible. When we look at, for example, what the Apostle Paul said about sexuality, there are a number of things that we have to interpret and reinterpret, and to recognize that the concepts that were common in his time are very different from the concepts that exist in our time. And that's not to say that we're right and he's wrong, but we may be talking about different things along the way. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think there's others in science that we'd have to think about. It may be a case where, in order to defend a conservative position, we have to change. So, for example, if you think about the whole issue of creation and evolution, if you want to defend the idea of a a universe created by a divine designer, I wouldn't begin with a vehement argument that the Earth is 6,000 years old. Doesn't seem like the weakest argument we could make. So it might be that if you're trying to preserve the spirit of what Ellen White wrote, insisting that creation is a valid understanding, you may need to change some things. You may need to focus on that and not this. It probably is not helpful that in our most recent statement of fundamental beliefs, we added some unbiblical language like creation was recent. I don't think most people even know what that would be. So that would be an example of defending an overall posture, but doing it in a different way and giving up certain arguments that are not working very well. I think you could apply that in a number of ways.
Okay, thanks so much for that question and response. Linda, it is time for you to join the conversation. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Anderson. The Word of God in the New Testament talks about in the last days, some of the gifts, one of them will be prophets. And there are prophets among us today. I wouldn't look at them as, being like infallible or nothing like that. For my doctoral, when I wrote my capstone, I quoted other authors. I gave them credit now, to be sure. I gave them credit. But I didn't look at that they were infallible, but that they had it right on this certain subject. And this is personal for me because Sister White, I hold her very dear. Years ago, when I was going through a crisis in my mental health, and I read the book, and it might be out of print because it's a 2-volume set, because I've been trying to get it. It's been probably over 30 years ago. It might be out of print, but it's a 2-volume set called Mind, Character, and Personality. It helped me with dealing with family issues, depression, whatever. I didn't think about Ellen White as, oh, she's some scholar, she copied, she this, she that. That didn't even enter my mind. The same as it didn't enter my mind when I was getting my sources for my paper. I realized those same sources, they could commit a crime one day and be put in jail. But that wouldn't mean that their source, that what they were talking about wasn't correct. And also back to there are prophets. It said, let me see if I can get it right. Old men would dream, something about dreaming dreams and seeing visions. We have among us in our churches. I don't know if we take advantage of it, but we do recognize other gifts. Prophets are among us today. I hold Sister White in high esteem. I think she was a sinner like me who took advantage of the grace of God for her, just like I am. And I see the humility, and especially I like what she wrote about the Civil War. So thank y'all.
All right, thanks so much, Linda. Dr. Anderson, any reflections on that?
Well, I keep thinking about how we're defining prophet. And I found that the definition that I offered in Reclaiming the Prophet was, for some people, a tremendous watering down, an evasion. Maybe I should quote that. And I'm a little mystified. I still don't understand this, why this is a bad way to define the term prophet. I wrote, the authors of Reclaiming the Prophet will often employ the term prophet to describe Ellen White. The point is not to mystify readers nor to hide her ordinary thoughts or essential historical context. Using non-technical layman's language, a prophet is a person who in God's name persuades, a leader who changes people's behavior. And I went on to talk about her achievements and the ways in which we need to take those into account. That bothered some people, and they thought that was explaining away a prophet. That was a bad definition of a prophet. I still don't quite get that. A leader is a person who in God's name persuades. That sounds like a prophet to me.
Right, quite an interesting approach there. George, please join the conversation.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. Appreciate everything you said. First, I want to make a brief confession. I got the electronic version of the book, and I was very interested because many of the authors were known to me personally. I know them personally. And so I started browsing the book, using some audible help because my macular degeneration doesn't allow me to read anymore. And I was browsing through it, and please don't take anything personally here. It's just my feelings that I am sharing. What came to my mind was, this sounds to me like an effort to sugarcoat a rotten cake. So I could not go and read the whole thing because it didn't make any sense to me. Knowing what I know, 45 years ago, I was still in the dark. Believe a faithful Adventist. I went to 4 years of undergraduate school of theology in Brazil, in São Paulo. And after had 12 years of, 16 years of total Adventist education, when a bomb exploded, and that was the Desmond Ford question and all that. And since I have been thinking about the ethics involved in all these issues. So I have a question for you. Do you think, how do you see this ethically? Is it that ethic to bring someone to the church? And in an Adventist church, the baptism is not just the baptism separated from membership. In many churches it is. You can be baptized there and not become a member of another church. But in the Adventist church, when someone is baptized, they are baptized into the Adventist church. My question is it ethical to baptize someone in these circumstances like this into the church without disclosing everything about Ellen White, all the flaws that we know, and having the person to study Adventism a little bit more? I studied Adventism until the age 30, only to realize I was not taught Adventism. I was not taught Adventism. I mean, so many things were hidden. And that the experience of becoming aware of reality suddenly is traumatic, is horrible, is terrible, and takes years, if ever, to recover from that. That's not right for any church to do to any human being. So is it really ethical to baptize people without informing them everything that is really available nowadays?
I want to go back. I want to go back to your comment about our book being sugarcoating. Did I understand you didn't finish the book? You didn't read the book?
That's correct.
Okay. Well, it's a little hard to defend the book under those conditions. We have a weird situation where our book has been attacked from both sides, where some of the official defenders of Ellen White have attacked our book, and other people who have more your point of view have also attacked it. I wonder what that means. Why people who don't agree on anything else agree that our book is a bad book or a dangerous book or an unfortunate book. Any idea what that means?
I don't think
I'm having a hard time thinking of the specifics of our book. I can't imagine someone reading John Butler's essay and saying that was sugarcoating. Or
I don't
reading.
think it's a dangerous book. I'm not saying that. For me, the parts that I checked were always sounding like, well, let's salvage, let's rescue Ellen White from something here, and it didn't work for me because I know so much about it, the whole story and the Adventist history. That's for me would be trying to rescuing her from something, but keeping her alive as it was, as is, if nothing happened, let's just move on and everything will be fine. I don't think so, but that's my personal position.
I think if you got to the end of the book, you wouldn't find the book was saying that. Sugarcoating really suggests you're really questioning our integrity. We've written a book and you're saying we're not being honest.
I didn't say that, and I don't think so. Your integrity is different, but there's an effort to. The title of the book is what?
An honest defense.
Okay, it's honest defense. That's fine, but it's still a defense of a situation that is not acceptable. What about the ethical part that I asked you a question?
Well, I don't think you should, if you're talking about baptizing people without telling them what Adventists believe, that of course is wrong. No question about that. You shouldn't baptize someone and say, oh, by the way, here's another belief we didn't tell you about. But I do think, we asked this question, how would your own life be different if you'd not encountered Ellen White? I'd be interested hearing from the rest of the class. Do you see, as several have mentioned, ways in which your life was enriched or changed in a positive way by Ellen White? Or is it all, as George is suggesting, kind of negative?
All right, we'll see if we get any takers responding to that while persons are thinking. I did get a question in the chat from Thomas Mello that I'll read. He wants to know if Ellen White would be viewed differently, more like Paul, John, or the other apostles, if she had been dead for nearly 2,000 years. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think another way you could ask that question is the way Paul McGraw commented on it in our book. He said with the Apostle Paul, we have his greatest hits, the things that were effective and made a difference to believers. We don't have everything he wrote. In the case of Ellen White, we have everything she wrote, including her motherly counsel to her wayward son, or her grocery list, and so on and so on. So it might be helpful if we had less. Can I say that?
You definitely can say that. Be sure. Ray, Bobby, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Well, to answer the question, firstly, even though some have said we didn't accept her because we were told she was infallible, but because we thought she was right, would not be correct for my upbringing in Adventist schools. Of course, that was 50s and 60s. That's the way I was brought up. You did not question EGW. Now, of course, even this was around some of the bigger schools, but probably we didn't have all of the understanding of EGW that we have now. So to me, she's an important person, but I do not view her as anybody being any better or any worse than any writer of the Bible. The question still comes back to me, We do not accept every single word by the writers in the Bible as a way of life. They wrote for their time, period, culture, and their way of understanding. But yet, we go on and on and on trying to explain Ellen White. I have difficulty with the obsession the church has with her. The IC.org is not admitting that she's just an inspired writer who wrote many, many good things, but she is not our guide in life, in everything. That word has never come out. And yet today, we still try to find ways of, we're arguing over her words, and I don't understand why we continue to argue over her words and try to come up with the correct interpretations. Is she just not been dead long enough so that we no longer have to do that? Or why? Thank you.
I'm intrigued by your reference to arguments. It seems like in the United States, Ellen White is more and more ignored. I can't speak for every place, and I'm interested in these comments from people who say, "Oh no, she's really central." Where in my experience, but I think the problem that the church faces is as a result of some inept responses to new historical evidence. We're really facing a danger that Ellen White will simply be eliminated from our history. I mean, I'm intrigued by that question 3, where someone says your defense of Ellen White is too late for most American Adventists under 40. Is that true? Have a large number of American Adventists of the younger generation just, it's not they're fighting her, they're not mad at her, she just is ignored. I wonder if any other people have comments on that. Is it true that Ellen White is losing her influence in the Adventist church?
All right. Yeah, and there are other persons who are weighing in on the other question you asked at the end. I guess after Ed, we can probably take some of those responses as well. Ed Kizarkowitz, please go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Anderson, you raise a good question about a church without this prophet. To answer your other question about what benefits Ellen White or her writings have been to me personally, I like some of her background, such as the Desire of Ages. So in studying the Bible, there is some good background things about Jesus. However, I think Veltman, an Adventist scholar in 1980, was asked to look at the Desire of Ages, and he discovered about 30% of it was borrowed. So that's very interesting. So there are other writers of her day who had some very good comments too about the life of Christ. And so what I'm getting from learning about all her borrowings or plagiarisms or whatever you want to call it is there were lots of other good writers. Now, she really emphasized the idea of the Adventist church being peculiar or on its own, so to speak, or separate from other churches, or keeping its sort of mission or purity. And yet she has borrowed so much from other writers. And I don't know, I find that a bit of a conflict or problem in my way of thinking. So if she borrowed so much, she must have had a lot of respect or utility for using other writings. And yet she wants the Adventist church to be peculiar, separate, and focused on her mission. So in the areas of health, she was really strong when it comes to that subject, to do with health reform, the Sabbath, the sanctuary, and the second coming. Now, you can't be a Christian if you don't believe in Jesus' second coming. I mean, it's all part of believing in Christ, because Christ said he's going to come again. So I don't think that's a valid reason to be a peculiar church. And the health reform, 80% of that she borrowed from other people. So that I don't think is really relevant. And I think to answer the last discussion, or I'm going to interject in your discussion there with George Tichy and say that Ellen White, for those who are under 40, for example, has become irrelevant. I mean, what is there to gain from studying her? She's really, she wrote from the perspective of the horse and buggy days. They didn't have cars then. They didn't have airplanes. They didn't have technology. So much in the world has changed. They didn't have AI and a whole bunch of different things. And so to write about the kind of world that we live in, a lot of it has lost its relevance, and just for that reason, I believe.
Well, you have a number of comments there in several different areas. I think it's very clear the church has not done a good job dealing with Ellen White's copying. And they started out by saying, oh, yes, we will deal with that. It's on Walter Ray. They really haven't. I think the other thing we've learned over the last few years is Ellen White really doesn't sit down to write a book like you or I would. She writes testimonies to people. She writes letters. She preaches sermons. She writes articles. But when we come to something like Desire of Ages, or even something like Great Controversy, what you have is a compilation of her ideas in other forms. And her literary assistants play a really big role in that. The idea, that I think many of us had at one point, that Ellen White would repair to her writing room and write a book, is very misleading. It's not the way she operated. But back to that question, I'd be interested in other responses. How has your own life been changed by encountering Ellen White? How can we, to get back to my conclusion there, how do we have moments of continuing conversation with Ellen White without treating her as inerrant or infallible or having no context? How do we continue to talk to her? I suppose you could simply say, we won't try, but I would be disappointed. I'd like to try to have continuing conversation with Ellen White.
All right, thanks so much for that, Ed. Lauren, I know you want to come back in here.
Yeah, about this time, I usually interject to let you know what's coming up on the Adventist Day Sabbath Seminar. Next week, we have a very interesting and very relevant young speaker, Lisa Diller, or Lisa Clark Diller. And some of you know Lisa. She's not just an educator. She's a very interesting speaker. And she also serves as a co-pastor of a church down in the Chattanooga area. So I always look forward to when we can have Lisa come, and she's going to be speaking next week. So just wanted to let you know that we have Gil Valentine's going to be speaking to us next month, and Kevin. Oh, give me a moment here. Burton. Kevin Burton is coming up. Yeah. So those are a few of the people that are going to be speaking to us, and looking forward to having them. I will come back to something that you asked here, Dr. Anderson. I keep trying to tell my California friends that the Adventist world out here is different from the Adventist world on the West Coast. I'm not saying it's universally different. There are certainly gospel-oriented Adventists. There are certainly Adventists who are not fundamentalist Adventists. But the statement, Ellen White said it, and therefore it must be true, remains very current out here where I live. I'm not sure. I'm not sure my California friends believe me when I tell them that. They find it hard to imagine, but it's true. It still defines how a pastor is expected to speak to his congregation, the things that he's willing to, that he's allowed to talk about, whether he gets ordained or not, if he's a young pastor. It all has to conform to Ellen White. So I just want to let you know that this is simply the case in much of the church.
All right, thanks for that, Lauren. Dr. Anderson, any reflections on that before we go to the next hand?
I keep noticing I've got some of my fellow contributors lurking here. I'm wondering if Jonathan or Gil or some of those others might add some comments to what we're saying here.
Okay, well, I'll just invite them to just raise their hand so we can see them, and I'll gladly pull them in the queue. Not seeing them just yet, so I'm gonna go to Linda, and then we'll hopefully one of them will join the conversation.
Thank you, Sherry Ann. Dr. Anderson, I think, judging by the number of people participating today, your topic has been one of certainly of great interest, and I feel compelled to answer the question that I think you've asked several times now, how our lives might have been different. And I don't mean to offend anyone's sensibilities, but my mother was highly obsessed about what Ellen White had to say about masturbation. And I can assure you that my brother and sister and I could have lived probably happy and productive lives without having to have that drummed into our heads time and time again. So you did ask, so I'm just letting you know about it.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's a good illustration of what ought to be central in Ellen White and what is less central and maybe should be forgotten. An appeal to mothers is even for the most conservative Adventists not something you see repeated, republished, recommended in the review. I'm reminded of, back in my experience in Borneo, of looking at the library in the Ayurmana school in Sarawak, and one of the books there was John Harvey Kellogg's Plain Facts for Young and Old. Really a very unfortunate book that I wish hadn't been in that library. I hope nobody read it. Anyway, no matter how you cut it, if we're trying to understand Ellen White in the year 2025, we've got to give a lot more attention to ministry of healing than to appeal to mothers.
Yeah. Well, I was answering your question, but I do have two questions that I don't think have been truly addressed today in our conversation thus far. One, just to kind of set the stage, there's a great deal of goings on in the press these days because apparently, for whatever reason, Cracker Barrel has decided to rebrand. And there are a lot of people that are very unhappy about that and raising a big stink about it. And it made me remember, I don't recall exactly how many years ago, but it probably had to be at least, 8 or 10 years ago, the Starbucks did something similar. They redid that Viking woman on the cups.
They took the name, the word off.
Yeah, they did something, and everybody went cuckoo about that as well. But then Today, nobody remembers that. Everybody's happy with the Starbucks logo, and it doesn't seem to cause any stress. And I guess my question, in a sense, is that there are probably a number of people here who, like me, just thought that the DNR, the Do Not Resuscitate thing, should have just long ago happened on Ellen White. We could accept the fact. In fact, it's interesting to me that most of what you had to say about her of a favorable nature is what I would call administrative. She may have been perhaps a really very good leader and moving and changing and helping the leaders that were around her focus on the things that were most important to have this little fledgling denomination survive. But what would really be lost if we decided to rebrand? If we said, well, Ellen White was really influential in the early church. Some of the things she wrote have been highly inspirational, and now we're just moving on. What would be wrong with that? That's my question number one. And my second question is, I'm really highly curious. I don't know you, and I know John Butler. I might know one of the others, but I think for the most part, I'm not familiar with you and your collaborators. Certainly not enough to understand motivation. And I wonder if you could say a little bit to us about how you all decided to do this. What happened? How did you sit down for supper one day, or did you attend a conference and say, hey, we should, let's write a book and defend Ellen White, or reclaim, which we think is a euphemism maybe for defend. And so I wonder what it was that caused you all to be motivated to do this. How did that process evolve and come to fruition in your mind? So those are my two questions.
Okay.
Brand, how did you get there?
Let me talk about how we got there. I think there was a consensus among a lot of senior people, people who were retired, that may be significant, that we were at a turning point. Two things happened in the last 5 years that we thought were very significant. One was George Knight's book, Ellen White's Afterlife. If you haven't read that book, it's a very significant book, talking about the way in which he was taught an imaginary Ellen White as a student at PUC in the early 60s. And then the other thing was Don McAdam's book, Ellen White and the Historians. And I think an awful lot of us felt that in the light of those two books, this was a chance to move on, to stop repeating old and counterproductive arguments and simply focus on something more valuable. We were saying, in lawyers' terms, we were saying, let's stipulate that Ellen White borrowed. Let's stipulate that Ellen White is not inerrant, that Ellen White's shaped by her context. Let's stipulate that the historian's work over the last 50 years is essentially accurate. Now, what can we say about Ellen White that's positive? What's useful about it? We were moved by the idea that long abuse does not prevent proper or reasonable use. So we really wanted to move away from simply fighting out in almost a metaphorical Verdun. The Veltman could come along and say 30% of Desire of Ages is plagiarized or borrowed or copied. And then someone else could say, no, it's not that, it's 25% or it's 3% or whatever. This is a waste of time. We need to say, all right, if she's a prophetic leader, what did she accomplish? What difference does it make to us? And I think for many of us, we were able to combine saying, on the one hand, yeah, we recognize this history. On the other hand, we owe something to her. And this is a group that included both Adventists and former Adventists. And they were saying, yeah, we owe something to her. I would say for myself, one of the most interesting parts of how I relate to Ellen White involves this word that seems to be so threatening to some people, particularly in high places, and that is the word devotional. Ellen White is more than anything else, she's a person who talks about how should we live. Devotional writing is not a waste of time. It's not something minor. It's not the 5 minutes at the beginning of class. Devotional is much bigger than that. And you have this wonderful statement that Denny Fortin has in his essay on what we mean by devotional writing. So I'm finding, as a person has had to teach Ellen White, studied Ellen White over many years, this is the way out for me. Quoting William Law, 18th century British writer, devotion signifies a life given or devoted to Christ. He therefore is a devout man who lives no longer to his own will or the way or spirit of the world, but to the sole will of God, who considers God in everything, who serves God in everything, who makes all the parts of his common life parts of piety by doing everything in the name of God and under such rules as are conformable to his glory. So if someone comes along and says, oh, you're trying to turn Ellen White into a devotional writer, what's wrong with that? That's not bad at all. That's a positive thing. And I would say for me, I've learned that she can teach me something, even though I'm not going to her to learn about the French Revolution or art in the Middle Ages or something like that, or even the age of the earth. There are things even more important than that that I can learn from her. That would be my own perspective.
All right, thanks so much, Dr. Anderson, and for those great questions, Linda. We're getting down to the tail end of things. Gil, you were asking you to join the conversation. Be able to unmute? Okay.
Yes, thanks, Joanne. Eric has invited us to chip in here to the conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm glad for the conversation happening. And I'm intrigued by Linda's question, rather penetrating question. Why can't we just move on and leave her in the past? And, you know, a couple of years' time, we'll be celebrating the bicentenary of her birth. 200 years is a long time. So time itself has moved us beyond her. And yet we can't somehow let her go. And why is that? And I would like to suggest perhaps some reason for the fact that we find it difficult to let her go. In a sense, what we are now, our sense of identity as a community of Adventists is related to our beginnings. They shape us, they shape our identity. And in a kind of paradoxical way, I think Ellen White has contributed to that and still contributes, and somehow will need to contribute that to that sense of identity even as we move forward. Eric has highlighted for us how Ellen White has been a builder, and that's one of the values that we see. Several speakers, I think, this morning have suggested that we are indebted to her for her role as an institutional builder. I mean, Loma Linda, the education system, the health system, she's made a tremendous contribution to who we are institutionally. And I would like to suggest that there's another major contribution that sometimes we're tempted to overlook. And I see, for me, this is how I understand New Testament as well. You know, the role of the gift of the charisma of prophecy in New Testament times was as a unifier, to build the unity of the community. And ironically, even though Ellen White is seen to be divisive in our community, yet in a strange way, she served to unify the community because she was a conflict resolver. She had a role in conflict resolution at many critical times during the church's development. And that, I think, was because she had the art of speaking out of two sides of her mouth, so to speak. She could say, oh, I said this in the past, but now, no, I'm going to say this. And Eric sort of highlighted for us the case study of the daily conflict, where she said, well, I did say that way back there in the early days, but don't make that an issue now. We need to move beyond it. It's not a big issue. Well, in my view, it was a big issue. And I think she was saying that with mental reservations, perhaps, or was she being disingenuous? Because in fact, the reinterpretation of the daily was a huge issue for those that were saying we need to understand Daniel 8:13 in its context in a much better way. And over time, in fact, that reinterpretation of Daniel 8:13 came to reshape our sense of mandate, our sense of identity, what our message was. We were to preach the gospel, even if it was against the way the Catholics understood it. So it really did reshape the future of the church. And yet, by saying, don't quote me on this from the past, you sort it out yourselves, she was actually performing the role of conflict resolution. Going forward, how can Ellen White still be a unifier in the church? I think we recognize that she had a profound influence on shaping us along the way. How could she continue to be a unifier? Ironically, I think one of the ways is by the fact that she did say things differently. She can be interpreted today even by different branches of the church quoting different sayings, and yet we are still together. The big umbrella of the church is somehow paradoxically facilitated by the GYC people being able to quote some things and the gospel people being able to quote some things, and yet we find a sense of unity. I don't know that that's very satisfactory, but for me, it works. and I'm glad for Eric pushing us together to come up with this book to help keep her relevant, even though she is now becoming more irrelevant. That's part of the paradox. Oops, sorry.
All right, thank you so much for sharing. So Dr. Anderson, we usually would be wrapping up around, we still have a few more hands. Just want to know if you are able to stick around for us to take these last set of
Well,
rounds.
I'm a little distracted at the moment because we have a significant fire not too far from us here at PUC. And I'm thinking of ways of finding cleaner air. It's even possible that some members of our family may be evacuating. So I'm thinking I do need to wrap it up here. To me, the issue that I would really like to emphasize at this point is we need to have an open discussion. And I do not understand at all how postponing conversation or suppressing conversation goes on. I think the kind of conversation we're having here, the number of people involved, all suggest that Ellen White remains a very live issue, and we need to do a better job of recognizing her historical roots and showing the way in which she can be relevant today. Certainly for some of us, I think there's been a long period where we've worked too hard on what's wrong with her. And we've neglected the part of what do we owe to her? What did she do to create the limb we're sitting on? And should we be sawing it off?
Thank you very much, Dr. Anderson. And I understand you have to go. Appreciate that. We're going to turn it over here to a few of the others too. We'll talk a little bit, and you
Okay.
can move on
And
and get to a place
I
of
think things are going to
safety.
be okay, but I'm a little worried about it.
Yeah, no, we understand. Get to a place of safety and make sure your family is okay.
All
Jonathan,
right.
do you want to join us and take over for Eric?
He's muted. Oh.
Come on, Jonathan. There he goes.
I'm not muted.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm on my phone and I'm having trouble with the technology. I've been told I'm a cretin when it comes to technology. So, well, I think Gil and Erica both made statements that serve very well as concluding statements. I mean, if I could just interject one comment, I think when it comes to Ellen White, and it seems like whenever she's raised as a subject, there are plenty of hands in the pot. You know, I mean, everyone's gets excited and is interested, which tells us something about her importance, whether you're negative about Ellen White or positive about her. I think it sort of boils down to what sort of church you want, or what sort of member you want to be in that church. Do you want Ellen White to be a Joseph Smith, or do you want her to be a John Wesley? You know, do you want her to be a Mary Baker Eddy, or do you want her to be a Martin Luther? Your understanding of the founder becomes important for defining what the church is, and I think Ellen White herself was a woman, as we kind of hear from many of Eric's comments and others. Ellen White went through a great deal of change in her whole life. She might have been a lot more like Joseph Smith initially, but comes out, when you read Desire of Ages or Steps to Christ, a lot more like John Wesley. And what we try to do is we say, well, she can't contradict herself, or she can't change. We have to hold her to whatever she once said. And I think that's a mistake. The Seventh-day Adventists, or when they were not even Seventh-day Adventists yet, when they were early Adventists coming out of Millerism, they were a far more sectarian group of people, far more marginal. Ellen White, in her early health teachings, was far more sectarian and marginal. But you look at Loma Linda University today, and that is a much more mainstream institution. And so I think we've got to allow that to happen, if that's the way it happens, you know. And most of us, as a result of Ellen White, got educations. And that means we undergo changes too. And we go off to school, our folks send us off to school, and we come back and we get into quarrels with them at Thanksgiving over what we've learned in school. We change as a result of education. And the church changed. It changed as a result of the medicalization of the church. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that we change in our view of Ellen White. I mean, just
my question for you, Jonathan, is can you sympathize with George's frustration? I felt bad that I meant to say this to Eric, but I didn't want him to take it personally. What George was saying. George is saying we have been force fed Ellen White for so long that even a defense of Ellen White is frustrating to us.
Mm-hmm.
Can you sympathize with that?
Yeah, but I think you know, we have to accept the fact that those people that force feed Ellen White are sort of on another planet. You know, I mean, I'm used to being around a family, uneducated members of my family and quite educated ones, politically left, politically right. I learned to live with that. I understand that people do change, and George has changed. He isn't the same person he was in his 20s as he is today. And he needs to understand that the church has changed and is changing, and Ellen White changed. And so I think this book is trying to sort of say, hey, we ought to be allowed to change in our understandings of Ellen White. We shouldn't be stuck in
I understand the value of remaining in conversation or interrogating our sources. Just to remember, Jonathan, unlike you and me, most of the Adventists in the church, and probably quite a few people on this call, are in places where that interrogation is not going on, which is why I kind of feel for what George was asking there when he says, why do you keep beating this dead horse? I think a lot of people kind of feel the frustration of wanting to let it go. But for me, I mean, the only thing that keeps me holding on, Jonathan, is as what I said. I got an education because of Ellen White. I wouldn't have had one. I would have been a farmer raising pigs in North Dakota, probably, if it hadn't been for Ellen White and the Adventist Church, which is not a bad thing, but I'm pretty happy how it turned out otherwise. Let me bring George into the conversation here. He raised his hand again, and George, I was trying to come to your defense there. I'm not sure if I did it very well.
Thank you. Since I was mentioned again, no, I think that you got my idea. You understood, and you got it right there. Because it was also mentioned, she could be used as a devotional, Dr. Anderson said. And it's strange. For me, I would not use any writing, devotional writing from a person who lied that way. She was with her, I was shown. So if 30% of the book, like The Desire of the Ages, was plagiarized, and she said, I was shown for everything I was shown, it was not true. It was a lie, a blatant lie. And the church keeps trying to kind of, let's use her as a devotional. Why would I use a devotional from a person who was lying that way? It's a crisis.
But George, wouldn't that be true of the Bible too? There's some pretty rotten characters who
wrote it. Yeah, but I think it's a little bit different here. The church defending her after knowing all those things. And so for me, it's it's no longer a theological problem. It was a theological problem when I started learning 45 years ago. Whoa, I didn't know this. The church never told me this, and still doesn't tell anybody. Only those who start digging, and they try to hide, and they're hiding a book now and hiding. Geez, this is a religious institution. Ethics is my problem now. As I asked Dr. Anderson about the ethics, he never answered my question, of course, he just brushed it away. It's an ethical problem. And you have so many ethical problems now that the church is not going to deal with it. And I believe the church is not going to deal with it at all. Those who are sensitive will leave. The youth will get the hypocrisy. They will not stay. I think this is the way. The original, the official church, in my understanding, is not going to change, because even a book that was kind of trying to, make a little piece there, maybe. Look what they did. So what is the hope? That's my perspective. Sorry that sometimes I'm very adamant about things. Yeah, I am. Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah, Jonathan, I think George raises a good point, and this is where the pastoral side of us needs to kick in, and that is that there are a bunch of people who are angry. they feel deceived. If my friend Art Clem was here today, he would join in on this, and he would say, "You just didn't tell me the truth in the first place." And I'm sympathetic with that in a way.
Right. Yeah. And I think if you're in sort of this ethical turmoil over reading an author, don't read that author. Read Kierkegaard. Read Barth. Read Reinhold Niebuhr. There's wonderful.
Read C.S. Lewis. Read A.W. Tozer.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I just finished another book by Ross Dalvitt called Believe, and enjoyed it. He never mentioned Seventh-day Adventist, and he's a Catholic, a Pentecostal who became a Catholic, and I was fed by that book. So I wouldn't. There's no reason to force yourself to read an author you're unhappy with. I don't believe that Ellen White understood what she was doing to be dishonest. We look back on what she did and say, well, there's dishonesty there. I think George needs to read my chapter where I deal with this very question. But I don't think. I mean, she's I don't think she wasn't lying, but I do think she was, well, I've always preferred the early Ellen White to the later Ellen White. I like reading the early writings, and I'm less happy reading Steps to Christ and Desire of Ages. Now that might set me apart a little bit, but I think that writing is far more stylized, and it's far less of her voice.
It was composed by our secretaries. Let me, Jonathan. Let me bring Bill Garber in here. He had his hand up for a long time.
Yeah.
Thank you. I wonder if we're just overthinking this.
Probably.
If you look at the history of prophets, they tend to show up when everything has gone to racks and ruins, and there's doubt everywhere. And that's exactly what happened on October 23, 1844. And here the people are, they're looking back and they're saying, in their own words, this experience with Miller was the most sublime sense of God's presence in my lifetime. And now it's like, well, I had it all wrong, but the presence was okay. And that's what Ellen White provided for the next nearly 20 years before the founding of the church. And it's not an inadvertent oversight that the church was founded without a creed. It was founded on an experience that was endorsed by Ellen White. And one of the takeaways is there isn't something you have to know. There isn't something you have to do. There isn't something you have to calculate to be okay with God. And is that not still true? And isn't that a great history? Not many Christian churches would look at it quite like that.
Good insight, Bill. We're running out of time. Marlon, join in here, and then we'll get Courtney and Ed.
Good. Yeah. Lauren, you mentioned that there was a bit of a disconnect between West Coast Adventism and East Coast Adventism or Mid-America Adventism. I'd also like to interject that there's a chasm between American Adventism and even Caribbean Adventism or Third World Adventism. Because a lot of the things that we discuss intellectually here and have different points of view, in Third World, I became an Adventist in Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. And we take Ellen White seriously. From eating, not putting butter on your bread, to to eating too much peanut butter. I mean, you name it. Seventh-day Adventists outside of the USA take the words of Ellen White seriously. It's not an intellectual discussion. And until the church makes a clear and decided statement on the spirit of prophecy, not only trying to define who is a prophet or what is inspiration, but how do you define a false prophet? We've never discussed how do you define a false prophet.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think a lot of the accommodations we make for Ellen White in Seventh-day Adventism, we are not so generous to make for other so-called prophets who existed around that time and helped to found some churches too. So I think we have to come clean, we have to come clear, because so many life decisions are made based on the spirit of prophecy in third world countries you would not believe. You would not believe how close it gets.
I suspect our African friends would say the same thing, and I suspect our Latin American friends would say the same thing, and probably those from India and in the Philippines and other places as well, Marlon. They would say we took it extremely seriously, and every word we took seriously. And I would say that there are tons of little churches across the Midwest. As I said to Eric, he kept saying, but people don't take her that seriously. And I was like, yeah, they do. They do. And the ones who don't are just gone. Courtney, are you there?
Yes, I am. How is everyone today? Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the feeling of deceit and the idea that we don't teach. We don't tell people when they're getting baptized that they um are, that they should believe in Ellen White or whatever. And to be honest, I don't think that we should say that, because I think it's the exact opposite. I know that I am not typical of of every pastor, but in my teaching to people, I taught what we actually say, which in recent years has changed on our website. But there was a time um, at the on the GC website where it used to have the preamble before the Seventh Day Adventists believe. And it was very clear that that list of fundamental beliefs, which has expanded over time, but that the list of beliefs is a summation of beliefs that are typical of Adventists, and that Adventists do not have a creed. These are beliefs that many Adventists believe. And the entire reason why that list was compiled was because it was in answer to questions of what people who were outside the church wanted to know. Well, what do Adventists believe? And when that list was compiled, it always used to have a preamble that explained that these are a list of common beliefs of Adventists, but we do not have any creed except for the Bible. And so there was always this understanding that even though many Adventists believe, this about Ellen White, it was never a mandate in order to be Adventist. And she herself even took great pains to say that her believing in her prophetic gift was not a necessity for or a mandate. I just lost my train of thought because somebody was talking. But she herself took great pains to say that she was not a test of fellowship. That is what
Yeah,
she said.
yeah.
And I think that we need to get back to that and allowing people to understand that it doesn't have to be something that drives a wedge between you. And we need to really teach the reality of what our fundamental beliefs actually are.
Yeah, part of the problem of being a congregational centered church, where we're supposed to be at least, is that you don't know what you're going to get in a congregation that you're in, though, Courtney. You know how
Yeah.
that is. I mean,
Yeah.
I went even farther than you. I didn't say anything about the fundamental beliefs. I said, "Do you believe Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior?
Oh,
Is it your desire to
short.
follow Him as your Lord, as His disciple? That's it."
Yep, the short baptismal vows, because in the church manual, you can have either the 13 or the 3, and I use the 3, and I don't think
Yep.
a lot of people do that.
Me too. Me too. Ed, you've got the last word here. Thank you, Courtney. Ed, you've got the last word. Where are you, my friend? There you go.
And there's two things. I think. Well, this will never happen. But anyways, the spirit of prophecy. In Revelation, it says Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. So there's one issue I have. The second, and others do. And the second thing is Ellen White is a prophet. Well, she herself said, "I'm not a prophet, I'm a messenger." So the church is hung up on this idea that she is a prophet, but she does things that a prophet might say or do. And
Actually, she went both ways on that, Ed. There are times when she said, "I'm more than a prophet." And she sometimes exaggerated her role, and other times she minimized it. We tend to use the part where she says, "I was the lesser light," but we don't quote the part where she says, "I'm more than a prophet."
Yeah, so there. Either way, I mean, there's a
Yeah.
problem here, and I think
It's a problem.
the church needs to water it down. Like if they said she's a inspired messenger, I think that would fly, and then she'd become more useful, I think, to many.
Well, the thing is we've been talking about here, a lot of us really very much benefited because Ellen White was part of our life. On the other hand, George is right. There's something deceptive about it that bothers us too, and I get that. Ed. I get that completely.